If you play video games, chances are that you have heard this term esports. It basically means electronic sports or competitive gaming.
This is very brave here from LGD. They're on top of the bar, and there's the teleport coming through. Ultimate already in for Twist of Fate. He's so close, and Aegon.
Now, where is he? That's the question. We see a rotation from Simple, creeping on shot, but he's missed his shot. 1v1. He doesn't know where Flamey is, but he may soon find out. Straight into the cross.
Some of the biggest titles that receive the major spotlight is Riot's League of Legends, Valve's Dota 2 and Counter-Strike, and Blizzard's Overwatch. Over the course of last couple of years, especially, the esports industry has managed to pull in some really big numbers in terms of its viewership and revenue. Surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, it's now at a level that comparing it to something like NBA or NFL is not a joke anymore.
Have you guys seen esports and the E-League?
I don't know if that's sports, but it's great sport.
I have not seen it, Ernest.
I have seen it. More than 12 million people attended live esports events in the US and Western Europe in 2014.
So how does esports actually compare with traditional sports? To some, it may be the most boring thing ever to see some dudes in their 20s playing video games. For others, it may be the most fascinating thing to watch, and that number of others is, well, growing. The best way to demonstrate this is through the numbers. In 2019, the video games industry generated $152 billion. That, in terms of revenue, is 3 times of what the global box office earned in the same year 2019. Think about some of the biggest movie industry stars. Yeah, there's still no match. This gets a bit more surprising when you see the same video game industry generated just about $20 billion a decade ago. The rate on which it grew in this decade is unlike any other the world previously saw, and so it doesn't surprise that much when you think a 15-year-old today would rather stay at home and play a game of Fortnite when in 2009 the same 15-year-old might have chosen to go out and play with his friends. As the internet evolved, our surroundings, our behaviors, but most importantly, our choices evolved too. 10 years ago, very few people would have chosen to actually watch a video game being played, mostly because there was much more or sometimes better choices to watch something on TV. Today, as we shift from television-based shows to internet streaming services like Netflix, esports has also come a really long way. In 2019, 454 million people around the globe watched esports, a 15% growth from the previously 395 million people. Newzoo's Global Esports Report estimates that this number in the next 2 years will increase up to 645 million people. This amount of growth has much to do with the number of choices that esports has to offer today in terms of different type of games, but a lot of it also has to do with the numbers of people actually playing the video games. The amount of $152 billion I mentioned earlier in this video wasn't just a number, it was the revenue generated from people buying the video games in a single year, a number which in 2009 was just $20 billion. What I'm trying to say is that today, more people are actually playing the video games than ever before, so it isn't surprising to see that why wouldn't they prefer watching it as well instead of something that they don't play. As the viewership numbers started increasing, people like you and me started putting in more and more money in the video games. This helped the game developers increase the prize pool of their esports tournaments. A great example for this would be none other than Fortnite. In July of 2019, Epic Games organized the first ever Fortnite World Cup and kept a prize pool of $30 million. This included the biggest prize money the world of professional gaming ever saw. This, in terms of comparison with traditional sports, was 4 times of what the IPL offered in the very same year and almost double of what the NBA offered. These are, if someone doesn't know, 2 of the biggest leagues of their respective sport. But much like in other aspects, as the esports culture started growing, there were also people who failed to realize its true potential and instead took it as an insult.
I am not a friend of esports, okay?
Why are you so against? I just don't understand.
Well, it's the same with professional wrestling. It's for booger eaters.
And I'm laughing because I can't think of anything less interesting, but
if you don't break a sweat, I don't consider it a sport.
We're going to talk about the 20 million people who are watching the damn thing.
And the money
they
that
got to
they're
be
making.
crazier than the ones
big money to watch it.
YouTube launched a new video network yesterday where you can watch other people play video games. For real, the whole network. It's called the we should all be very ashamed of ourselves for failing his parents' channel. Actually, it's called YouTube Gaming, and I don't get that. To me, you know, watching another person play video games is like going to a restaurant and having someone eat your food for you.
Now, I won't talk about one person in specific here because online you can find several people like these. What I fail to understand is why. Why do people think that esports is a threat to real life sports? And why do it seem to have a problem calling esports a sport? I mean, any person who has ever watched a game of any sports would be able to agree with me that sports is, after all, just another source of entertainment. And as long as it's in line with skill competition and entertainment, I don't see a problem calling esports a sport. Esports is not a threat to real life sports, nor does it take anything away from it. In fact, the only argument that seems to be circulating in this conversation is a lack of athleticism involved in esports, which stay with me, we'll touch down on that point as well later in this video. Much like traditional sports, esports isn't really connected with traditions or religions, but what it does do is bring people together and form communities. Much like when a group of friends gather to watch a World Cup final, esport fans connect online to watch their favorite game being played by their favorite players. And as you keep thinking, you realize that esports from traditional sports is not much of different. What started as arcade game in late 70s has now transformed into a global phenomenon. But is esports even a sport? The idea that a person sits on a chair with his one hand on a mouse and other on his keyboard while staring at his monitor might not sound the most fascinating idea for a sport when compared to something like this.
For Tavares, can't get it there, bursting in is Crosby, trying to get through, he scores!
And that's the point. One thing that makes esports different from traditional sports is that they aren't typically as physical. But if physical effort defines a sport, then what about archery? What about stationary target shooting? What about racing? And what about chess? Is that a sport? Because all of these come nowhere near to the amount of physical exertion when compared to something like basketball or rugby. However, they both make up to an Olympic sport. Games like StarCraft require its player to not only have a really good mind for split-second decision making, but also to be incredibly fast with their hand movement. Similarly, shooting games like Counter-Strike and Rainbow Six Siege require its player to be really precise and accurate, something which in gaming terms is referred as having a good aim. Dictionary.com defines sport to be an athletic activity requiring a skill or a physical prowess that is often of a competitive nature. Another thing that makes esport different from conventional sport is that the rules of the game does change quite often. To really understand the importance of this, let's take an example from soccer. Imagine if the length of the match is extended to 180 minutes from just 90 minutes. Imagine the ball they're playing with suddenly gets bigger or smaller. Imagine if FIFA announces that the game will now begin from the ball being dropped from the sky. In some cases, you might argue for this being sort of game-changing differences, or in some cases, even game-breaking. But at the same time, esports enthusiasts claim this to be something to be a part of their game, to be able to adapt with the situation faster than your opponent. This, in their perspective, keeps evolving the game, something that can lead to the introduction of new strategies, new playing styles, something that can make the game more enjoyable and unexpected, something which from the company's point of view is great to pull in some new big numbers. Esports in its current state is looking great. To name a few, there are fully sponsored scholarships for dedicated esports players, there are dedicated TV channels for news regarding video games and esports, and its ultimate growth is inevitable. By the time I'm making this video, the world is going through an unfortunate pandemic, which has forced everyone to sit inside their homes, so the traditional sport is almost completely stopped. This has paved the way for even bigger numbers for esports industry. The 11th season of Counter-Strike's ESL Pro League saw the viewership of some 490,000, which marks the record for the game's concurrent viewership. Similarly, League of Legends LCK tournament saw the viewership of over 1 million concurrent viewers during a match between T1 and Genji. Needless to say that in my perspective, esports is the next big thing, and these tough times saw, if nothing but massive success and growth for esports. And soon as this all ends, these massive stadiums are ready to host them again.